my size.
I don't know what's Medevac.
Medevac is...
I know.
Good citizens of Brisbane and visitors, it'd be good if you gathered a bit closer and made a bit of an impact on me as I speak and introduce what is going to be a very important rally, part of a national day of action around the nation. It is a very important issue, and don't miss our speakers. They are an excellent range of speakers. Firstly, as is our tradition in the Refugee Action Collective, I would invite one of our very respected Aboriginal elders to welcome you, all of us, to country. I give you Bob Anderson.
Yes, thank you very much, friends. It's a pleasure for me to give a welcome to this country, and I do it with great respect. Meganship is a traditional language name for this area, and in doing so I show respect to Turrbal, Yuggabal and all others who have walked this land. I also speak as a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, and uncle to many nieces and nephews. And I am absolutely appalled at the treatment that has been meted out to the refugees, and Peter Dutton is the responsible minister, acting on behalf of our Prime Minister, ScoMo. And ScoMo's philosophy is, if you have a go, you get a go. Well, what about giving the refugees a go? Yeah, what about a ScoMo? And I have our voices today echo through your messenger, Peter Dutton, who ought to be ashamed of himself when you talk in terms of the Christian people being brought up with the concepts of the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments, I call them the guide to form, set out quite clearly of what our responsibilities are to ourselves, but principally to others. So together it's a meeting for us that we should remember and pass the messages on why we were here. And the question we would ask is how many times more do we have to gather before the indications of the spirit of this great nation, this great Aboriginal nation, this great Aboriginal land, is echoed through the legislation of Prime Ministers. So again, I'm so pleased and proud to have my association of all of you wonderful people. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a welcome that is very important to all of us. Aboriginal land was never ceded. It is this land, and we respect the custodians who've kept it, looked after it for us for so long. Your presence here is a message to government. The gloves are off. Enough of politics before people. You disgust many of us. Enough of this deliberate cruelty to human beings in your care. I want you to roar your disapproval. Yes, for 7 long years, our elected members of Parliament have been collectively responsible for a human tragedy of their own making. We acknowledge and thank the minority who have defended universal human rights and challenged the false policies around innocent people who came by sea asking for our protection. Governments of both varieties have punished them instead of welcoming them and of respecting their human dignity and giving protection to those who meet the criteria of the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. And I remind you, all of us, to remind your MPs and senators that it was the Prime Minister of the Liberal Country Party government under Robert Gordon Menzies who signed that international convention which legally obligates us to this day. The Morrison government has not repealed its commitments to the UN Refugee Convention and protocols, and it knows that they breach the terms of international law. They know they are not complying. Today's rallies around the nation are so important. Yes, to the stranded refugees and asylum seekers whom Australia paid to be held indefinitely in neighbouring countries of Nauru and PNG. Yes, to those neighbours whose constitutions we have trashed. Yes, to all the men and women who have worked and lobbied to reform the evil policies and who have supported and walked with the refugee victims of Australia's cruelty. Today, we do acknowledge the good guys, the whistleblowers, who blow the whistle on illegality, on inhumanity, on sadism and mistreatment of men, women and children. You can recall all those reports. I can never forget the early report from the young Manus doctors, and who can forget the Nauru files? They are a horror story. They stand on the record. Today, we thank those brave Australians, those principled people. We certainly owe you. And today, it's the medical profession leading the charge on supporting the retention of the Medevac legislation. Leading, yes, but so strongly supported by other workers, community leaders, spiritual leaders, and refugees and former refugees themselves. And we thank the international community, the organisations who investigate, research and report on the human rights breaches of asylum seekers and refugees in Australia's care. Indeed, it is shameful.
Send them all back to where they came from.
It is shameful. It is shameful that we have a government without ears. Together, we will prevail. We are still a democracy, and the sleeping moral giant of quiet Australians is waking up. Our first speaker is not new to us. Dr. Barri Phatarfod is a medical doctor, proud president of Doctors for Refugees. You've seen her on your TV screens, telling the truth about what is wrongly being done in the name of all Australians. She is one of many human rights advocates starring in the documentary Against Our Oath, which for you is a must-see. It's a must-see for all those who watch commercial television in particular. Google the title, buy or rent a copy, and share it in your own network. It is a stunning contribution to the fight for refugee rights. Dr. Barri.
Thank you, Freddie. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on traditional land that was never ceded. I'm talking today about the Medevac law. The Medevac law enables doctors to be the one to determine if a patient needs urgent medical care that's not available on Manus Island or Nauru. And it provides a clear time frame for this to happen. And that's all it does. Now, this is something that Australian doctors are used to doing every single day. If a person has chest pain, a doctor is the one who decides if that person needs further investigations or an ECG, or if they need to see a specialist cardiologist, or indeed if they need to be taken by ambulance to the nearest hospital. Now, in none of these scenarios do we ever need to take it via the federal government. Now, the Medevac law does not enable doctors to have any input whatsoever into visa categories, or to challenge refugee determinations, or to make any other immigration recommendation whatsoever. Doctors have absolutely no interest in immigration law. We just do not like seeing disability and death at our hands. And that's the thing with the Medevac law, because prior to its installation, we actually saw 12 people die in the offshore centres in 6 years. Since its introduction, no one has died. Now, surely that's a good thing. They say that before Medevac, the system was operating just fine. Well, we know that it wasn't. Because of the 500 cases that Doctors for Refugees has had referred to us, the overwhelming majority involves unacceptable delay in getting the appropriate medical treatment. And I'm just going to run through a couple of the examples. A man was in a motor vehicle accident and waited 3 weeks in agonising pain to have an abdominal CT scan. And when he finally had this done, it confirmed a multi-organ rupture. He was immediately flown to Royal North Shore Hospital and had massive prolonged abdominal surgery which removed part of his bowel as well as other organs, and spent several weeks recovering. Now, anyone who knows anything about ruptured bowels is aware that he could well have become another fatality. A woman has had daily bleeding for 2 years after a gang rape in Nauru. Another man had a depressed skull fracture from a machete attack and also waited a dangerously long time before an X-ray was finally agreed to. One man lost his eye because there was a prolonged delay after he was attacked in the attacks in February on Manus Island and PNG. Now, the surgeons recommended an immediate evacuation, but the Australian government refused. The surgeons wanted him to be evacuated immediately while there was still a chance that they could save and reattach his eye. But instead, they had to put a table tennis ball in the empty eye socket. More recently, we've been advocating for a 2-year-old girl who was comatose after encephalitis, which is an infection in the brain. And the doctors on Nauru recommended that she get transferred to ICU in Australia, but instead, Border Force opted to send her to Papua New Guinea from Nauru, which unsurprisingly was completely ill-equipped to treat this young girl. And eventually she was brought here, but the extra expense involved was $120,000 just for the flight to take her to Papua New Guinea instead of to Australia. Also, people have waited several years, sometimes 4 or 5 years, for treatment that have been recommended by the specialists there. Now, we know of at least 2 cases where 3 separate cardiologists have made a recommendation, and yet each time the government has deferred and flown in somebody else. Because that's the thing with the offshore medical advice. If the government doesn't like the advice it's given, they'll just fly in more specialists from around the world. One guy was seen by a cardiologist from Fiji, and then from Australia, and then finally they flew someone in from India, all of whom gave exactly the same advice. And then, of course, there are the deaths. There's been at least 12 deaths that we know of in the offshore centres, and it was in this city, not far from here last year, that the Queensland coroner determined that Hamid Kazai's agonising death in 2014 was entirely avoidable if the doctor's urgent and increasingly desperate recommendations had not been overridden. Now, there was no delay on the part of the doctors, but only on the part of the Immigration Department, who overruled even his transfer from Manus Island to the Port Moresby on Papua New Guinean mainland. Now, I sat every single day in the 4-week hearing and heard the voice recordings and the transcripts of all the doctors desperately pleading to move this critically ill man. And each time they were ignored or they were overridden, until finally 24-year-old Hamid was brain dead when he was transferred to Brisbane Hospital. Now, the Queensland coroner, Terry Ryan, found that in the case of Hamid, it was solely the department overriding doctors' advice that led to his tragic death. And he made a series of recommendations to prevent further deaths happening. And one of these is essentially the Medevac Bill. So here now, doctors should be the ones to decide when a patient needs evacuation free from bureaucratic interference. These doctors who assess the patient on site are actually those who are contracted by the Immigration Department itself. So they go through the most incredibly rigorous scrutiny to weed out those that the governments feel may have potentially conflicting ideology. And once they are there, As we've seen, the government is very quick to fire those if they don't conform to government policy. And yet, almost every single successful transfer that we have seen to Australia has required a court hearing, where the government has either lost or settled at the last minute on each one. So why have these expensive coronial inquests and court cases if nothing changes? Is the government suggesting that the Queensland coroner is a naive lefty? Are the AMA, that bastion of medical establishment and authority, or the 11 peak medical bodies and colleges, the church groups, the maritime workers, are we all somehow politically motivated? Or can it be that we can just see the slippery slope when you deny people urgent medical care purely for political gain? This is a horrifically dark chapter in Australia's political discourse. Nowhere else in the world would they accept denying urgent medical care to traumatised individuals. The world collectively cries when we see villages on fire and children dying and fathers with their limbs hacked off and their wives and daughters raped and mutilated beyond recognition. Some of these wars Australia's had a hand in and others not. But unlike other countries, instead of caring for them, making them feel safe, secure, we've locked them up on remote Pacific islands. Now that's appalling enough. They're packed into overcrowded and mouldy tents, susceptible to a whole host of tropical infections which can kill them, and are in often a hostile local culture where they are beaten, stabbed, attacked with machetes and raped. And as a side note, no one has been prosecuted for the vast majority of these crimes. So the remaining people who are not so assaulted and attacked live in constant fear that the same thing can happen to them with impunity. And yet, this is still not enough to satisfy the bloodlust of this government, because that is exactly what it has become, a blood sport. How cruel, how degrading, how traumatic can we make life for these miserable people? I know, we can deny them medical care because that's really the only thing left. Actually denying them health care. Even prisoners of war get a better deal, and certainly our own domestic prisoners. Now, there's no dissent about the standard of care. No one, not even the government, is arguing that doctors do not provide the best level of care. Health professionals are the only ones who are trained to take a proper history from the patient, conduct the relevant examination, and then refer if necessary. If your father had a heart attack or your child had meningitis, who do you want looking at the ECG or the blood results? An Australian trained doctor or Peter Dutton? No, the government is actually saying that they don't deserve appropriate care, which is really what this whole discussion hinges on. They deserve to be kept in these horrendous conditions and hope and pray that good luck doesn't see them have the same fate as Hamid and the other 11 who tragically lost their lives. Why do they deserve this? Well, none of the previous reasons have worked so far. So the latest one is that they are laughing at Australia. They're taking us for mugs. Because no one likes being laughed at. So this very primal fear is the latest to be used and exploited. Listening to Dutton and Morrison and others is reminiscent of a sporting coach firing up their side or an army sergeant preparing for battle against the enemy. Only these are highly traumatised individuals fleeing persecution. And we all know this because we've seen these images on TV every night. And seriously, how can an intelligent country, how can intelligent people in the community believe that an accountant, a doctor, an engineer, a nurse from the other side of the world has just suddenly decided to throw in their career, take their family and their life savings and put them at the mercy of a long and arduous journey just to laugh at Australia? Can we hear ourselves? Are we really that far removed from the rest of the world that we have no concept of what is going on? And we just want to protect our own little patch of playground because the teacher says it's okay to beat up on the weaker kids. If you disagree that this is a blood sport for the government, keep in mind that there are currently less than 600 individuals that this bill is referring to. 600. This is an absolutely minuscule amount. by both world standards and also as a percentage of Australia's already very tiny population. Yet denying this 600 individuals proper medical care has received an astonishing disproportionate amount of airtime, funds and political energy. So I'm just going to finish with a story. I just came back from the US where I visited many of those that have been resettled from Manus Island and Nauru. And one of the most shocking stories I heard was that of a young girl who'd been resettled with her family in a US town and was recovering slowly. And all of a sudden one day she starts crying uncontrollably. And as it turns out, at the table next to her was an Australian backpacker, and the sound of his accent triggered the memories of Nauru. This is the country we've become. We cannot allow it to get even worse, if that were possible, by denying individuals life-saving healthcare. Thank you.
You've heard some terrible stories, and I can tell you that can be multiplied hundreds and thousands of times over the 7 years of this dreadful human tragedy. Here in Brisbane, we are the transit centre where aeroplanes come from Nauru, come and go from Nauru, with workers, with Nauruans, and also with very sick people. And occasionally in the past, some, after receiving treatment, have been returned to the place that made them so ill. Our next speaker speaks for and knows many of the stories that have come to her and to her professional colleagues as the nurses, the carers in hospitals and all places where our refugees and asylum seekers are held. We know that most of them are not in freedom, and the stories are ones that I want you to remember and to tell 10 people next week. Our next speaker is Sandra Eales, Assistant Secretary, Queensland Nurses and Midwives Union. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we gather today on, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and the emerging leaders. I thank the Refugee Action Collective for organising this rally and everyone who's attended to speak on behalf of the retention of the Medevac Bill and to show their support for refugees. Thank you. This is a pivotal point for our community and our society more broadly. Today I want to talk to you. I'm not going to tell the stories of individual refugees. I just want to talk about my experience and the values as a nurse and a midwife and a mother and a creator of the culture that we live in. So I'm here today to lend my voice and the voice of 60,000 Queensland nurses and midwives, and nationally as part of the Federated Union, the ANMF, 250 nurses and midwives across the country. So they stand behind me to fight for this bill, for the retention of the bill, which was only voted into Parliament this year. The bill grants basic access to life-saving medical services, and that decision, that triage process, to be conducted by the people who are trained to do that. So the right to determine whether refugees are granted access to medical care should be done by medical and not politicians, as has been discussed. Access to care to save life and protect health is a basic human right. The values that underpin the nursing, the caring professions, but particularly nursing and midwifery, are professionalism, caring, holism and advocacy. Nurses and midwives work to protect those in their care and have long acted as advocates and whistleblowers for their patients. That's the job, that's the core at what we do and how we live our lives, and that's what the community expects of us. That's how we fulfil our contract with the community. What happens to nurses and midwives when they're prevented from living those values in the work that they do, when there's a gap between the way we see ourselves and how we are at our core and the way we act out our lives? When there's a gap there, it creates significant moral distress. And so that happens to nurses and midwives and doctors when they are prevented, when doing their job becomes illegal through this sort of action of Morrison government. And more broadly, it happens at a community and societal level. So that's why I think this is a pivotal point in our growing how we're going to be as a society. So Australian nurses have played an important role, and often challenging role, in raising awareness of dangerous and inhumane conditions in offshore detention. Brave nurses have defied non-disclosure contracts to draw public attention to conditions that can only be described as cruel. We celebrate their courage in speaking on behalf of refugees, many who have endured unimaginable heartbreak after being forced to leave their homes and set out across the world. We applaud the existing Medicare Bill and the ongoing attempts of all caregivers, Australians and people over the world, to help refugees as they search for a safe place to call home. Refugees fleeing conflict, famine and many other life-threatening situations deserve better from Australia. We have free and ready access to world-class public hospitals and health services. These services, along with our general sense of safety in Australia, can easily be taken for granted. Access to life-saving service is not a right that refugees can afford to lose, many having lost so much already. So the problem isn't going to get better. The increasing crises and the more, increasing conflicts are going to put more pressure on, and we need to find a more humane way to connect and deal with people in crises. In response to the international crisis, Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his government, which includes many Queensland federal senators, continue to send unknown numbers of refugees to be detained in the United States. Others are housed offshore on Narrow and Manus, and a number remain in Papua New Guinea. In addition to the rehoused and offshore, Morrison seeks to revoke the rights of refugees to fast, effective medical and health treatment. Since the bill was introduced, more than 130 sick refugees have been approved for medical treatment in Australia. But in the coming weeks, Morrison and his government seek to overturn that ability for refugees, including lots of children, to access the necessary care. Morrison's recommendations, Australian senators will soon vote to remove, and so what we have done, we've sent out to all our members to put pressure on the crossbenchers to sign the petition and put pressure on the government to let them know that this doesn't sit with Australian values. The Queensland Nurses and Midwives Union believes that Australia has a moral and legal obligation to treat every human being compassionately and treat them with respect, courtesy and consideration. The union believes the Australian government has a role to play in protecting people living in countries where persecution and conflict is taking place. We believe the Australian migration system should be responsive to the needs of people who live in societies where oppressive regimes
armed conflict, poverty, famine and environmental disasters forced them to seek asylum. Nurses and midwives firmly believe that those seeking asylum in Australia should receive treatment which is consistent and humane, regardless of how they entered Australia or their country of origin. As such, the QNMU has this week asked, as I said, 60,000 nurses and midwives nationwide to sign the Refugee Council of Australia's petition, and I hope that everybody else here does the same and passes it on to their friends and family. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. We know that in the caring professions, amongst caring people in Australia, great work has been done. And I can tell you from my experience that the people whom you have helped and walked with value you and what you have done. They are sad that the government, that the majority of Australians vote, don't see it the same way. Now today and in other places around Australia, we are remembering the latest of the deaths in immigration imprisonment. And we will be sending around the buckets to raise money to return to the land in which he was born at the request of his parents, the body of this man, Dr. Syed Mirwais Rohani, born in Afghanistan, died by his own hand here in Brisbane when he committed suicide in total despair and hopelessness, I dare say, on the 15th of October. 5 days later, in Sydney, another man in the same limbo life hanged himself in the mosque. Please, if you can, give generously to the people moving amongst you now who are collecting to raise enough money to repay the individuals who have advanced the loan to repatriate Mirwais's body to Afghanistan to be with his family and his ancestors. There are people here in our community who knew him over the past 2 years, and they knew how irreversibly damaged 4 years on Manus Island had been for him. And today I ask you to remember his loving parents who came all the way from the UK to visit their son. Dad visited him in PNG and again here in Brisbane, and Mum was here when he took his own life. There is no substitute for the voices of the witnesses, those with the lived experience, as we say, the lived experience of fleeing persecution. It is they who can tell their story, and they do so even when it may re-traumatize them. But they do so to keep the faith with their fellow refugees and tell it how it was for them and warn us about what is still being done in our name to the men, women and children who came by sea in order to find safety, freedom, peace and a future. We were to have a speaker who himself came by sea a long time ago and who knows exactly what it is to live a life in limbo. I respect that he has chosen not to come out in public and speak today on this very emotional situation, and he's given me permission to talk as a long-time advocate here about what happens to people in community detention. Sure, they come out of the detention centres, the camps in isolated Australia and the camps in offshore islands. They come here, but they are not free. It is the peculiar triumph of this current Morrison government and Morrison as minister that we have enshrined in legislation that because an asylum seeker, most of whom were refugees the moment they left home, because they came by sea on a boat, that they are never to settle in Australia. So we have a cohort of people who live in limbo. They cannot plan their future. They cannot attend university without paying full-up international student fees. The men cannot always find the work that pays a fair salary to keep paying and sending money to their family. And I tell you that the most bitter thing for me as an advocate in this area is to describe to you the women and the children who are the innocent collateral damage of an asylum policy that is plain evil. When you see your politicians talk about their families and the need to spend more time with their families, ask them to think of those families that are separated, not because they want to, but because they have no eligibility to sponsor dependent wives and children. It is enormous pain to most of the people I work with that the children who were left behind 6, 7 years later will not talk to dad on the phone, on Facebook, in any way at all. And the charge against these brave men who set out to find a life for their family is, Dad, you keep telling us you're sending for us, but you never do. I don't believe you anymore. And our policies have now cut a huge gap between those children and their fathers here in Australia. And you wonder about the mental health of everyone who lives in community detention, who lives in the alternative places of detention, sometimes motels, where the windows are blocked out on the ground floor and they're not allowed out except with guards, supervised every moment of the day. And there are people who are in the Baita, our immigration prison at 100 Sugar Mill Road in Pinkenba. Some brave people, some of you here, visit those people in detention and keep their survival instincts alive for a little bit longer. But like our dear Syed Mirwais Rohani, sometimes it is too much to bear. The pain is too great. I have spoken recently with the children of the men who came in 2000 and were on temporary protection visas for 3 years. And then they had the right to apply to bring their family here, to sponsor their refugee wife, their refugee children. And that took another 2 years. So 5 years after leaving their children, these men were reunited in Australia with their families. And the children tell me that that gap in their growing up is very, very difficult to bridge, to heal. And we can understand that. So living on a temporary visa, on a bridging visa of any sort that is temporary, that has no future, is living hell. That's why we call it limbo land. And my friend who chose not to speak today, he would have a very sad story to tell of what it meant in his family. But believe me, the generic story is as I have told you, and I have heard it from many. So it is the Medevac Bill which also needs to be there to protect and to encourage all medical professionals and all politicians to ensure that the best that Australia has to offer is available to people whom we have treated so badly. I have a couple of announcements to make. Reference was made by Barri, I think, about the 47 men who were in an Australian-built, I think it was over 20 million of your dollars, a detention centre built next to the Bomana prison in Port Moresby. 47 men, some of whom refused to engage in the process. They said, we didn't seek asylum in Papua New Guinea. We came to Australia. Australia is picking up the bill for our imprisonment. It is Australia who must decide our future. So these men, including some who failed the pretty dodgy system, have been jailed now for 88 days, and they are incarcerated in the worst conditions that you and I would not tolerate under any circumstances, and nor would the members of Parliament if you dropped them into that situation. The Refugee Action Collective, which has again put together this rally for this occasion, will be having a protest about the men still in the Bomana Immigration Detention Centre on Wednesday the 27th of November at midday outside the Department of Home Affairs in Adelaide Street. You have opinions, you need to have your say, and here on the two tables here are some post-it notes where you can have your say. It is our own Lenin's Wall, and I encourage you to all have a say. On the rack stall here is a brochure about the Medevac situation. If you want to know more facts, please pick that up. And now join me in welcoming our last speaker from the Greens Party, which consistently has had the best policy on asylum seeking as a human right, who have campaigned in Parliament and in the community, who have sent representatives to see the detention conditions of our refugees in Port Moresby, on Manus Island and Nauru when possible. It is the Greens who commit us to complying with international law. And I thank very much Senator Larissa Waters for being here today, one of the justice warriors in our Parliament, and a member of a party which last evening had a dinner which raised funds for the group that I work with at the Indooroopilly Uniting Church, a refugee support hub that helps this vulnerable group of people with all the forms that they must say. It was enormously successful in that it raised money, in that people heard things that they will take away and spread, and that people like me and my colleagues feel that there are others protecting our backs in this very difficult space. Thank you, Larissa.
Thank you so much, Freddie, for that really warm welcome, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to add my acknowledgement of the traditional owners, and thanks to Uncle for giving us a formal welcome. We here at the Greens acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, so we stand here on Aboriginal land. It always was and it always will be. And until, as a nation, we can finally have treaties and sovereignty, then the journey for reconciliation will be a very long one, but it's one that I know we all pledge to commit ourselves to. I'd also like to acknowledge a few other special people in the audience. First of those is former Senator Claire Moore, who represented Queensland in the Senate for the Labor Party, not the party to which I belong, but who was an incredibly strong voice for social justice in all of its guises, for women and in particular for asylum seekers. So I saw Claire earlier. I'm not sure if she's still here, but Claire, we really appreciate your presence here, and thank you for all the work that you did within your party to improve the approach that this nation takes in all of our names. I'd also like to mention that we've got a few Greens candidates here. We've got council elections coming up, so I'll be in strife if I don't introduce the lovely Donna, our candidate for Paddington, and Kath Angus, who is our Lord Mayoral candidate. Obviously, we have Greens everywhere seeking your support, and thank you for being here today. But folks, what a rough time we're in at the moment as a nation. It feels to me like our government just does not represent the values of Australians. And yet, someone voted them in. So I haven't quite resolved the complex feelings that I have post-election. There are some good news stories, and one of those good news stories was the fact that for more than 10 years of fighting, the Parliament finally passed laws to say that people who have sought asylum that are sick would be able to seek medical help. If they couldn't get that there on Manus or on Nauru, that Australia would bring them here and treat them and meet their very basic needs. Now that was great, but what an absolute tragedy that bare minimum, that shred, that sliver of human rights is all that we could get through the Australian Parliament when we've been fighting for years to end those offshore detention camps, those torture factories, to bring people who have broken no law, who have committed no crime, who are just wanting to start a new life here in our incredibly wealthy, prosperous and safe nation, where we pride ourselves on being the country of the fair go. What an absolute heartbreak that all we could get through the Parliament after all those years of trying with all of those good other people in other political parties, all we could get was this Medevac Bill. And it only just passed. And it was because they were in minority government at the time. And now here we are, 8-9 months later, and now the government who were re-elected now want to repeal even that minuscule protection for human rights. It is absolutely heartbreaking. Just when I think that the government can't find a new low, a new way to be cruel to people, they somehow manage to come up with one. You've got to give them points for being creative, because boy, they just keep finding a new bottom. There's a shred of hope. And I'm sorry it's such a depressing reality, but you all know, and you've all been fighting for so many years for justice for people who just want to start fresh and see their families safe and thrive and get an education, have their healthcare rights respected, and maybe not be persecuted for their very beliefs and not be under threat of violence just for leaving their doors. The shred of hope is that the government still doesn't have the numbers to repeal the Medevac Act. There's one person, because the Senate is a very important place and the balance of power is something that is this is a perfect example of why it's so important to think about your Senate vote when the next election rolls around. There's one person who still hasn't said how they're going to vote on this bill, and that one person has the swing vote. So we know that the Labor Party are standing firm on keeping the Medevac laws, and we thank them for that, because can't always get a great result, but I want to commend the Labor Party for being on the right side of history on at least this issue with the Medevac Bill. We've got Centre Alliance, the old Xenophon Party. Obviously the Greens are supporting rights for people seeking asylum. Obviously the government want to find new, cruel, inhuman ways of depriving people of what human rights they've got. And sadly we know that Bernardi and One Nation are naturally lining up to back the government's agenda. It's Jackie Lambie who is the swing vote. And the reason I have a shred of hope is that the government still hasn't listed this bill for debate next week. We've got a Senate sitting week coming up and flying off to Canberra tomorrow. If they thought they had Jackie's vote to repeal Medevac, they would have that on the list for Monday. And in fact, we will know the moment they have her vote, that bill will be listed. So we've still got a task ahead of us as people that I think represent the best of Australia, that represent compassion, humanity, common decency. I mean, it's not too much to ask that sick people get medical help and that doctors assess when someone needs medical help, not members of Parliament. I mean, it's not like you go to Peter Dutton to fix your car. You go to the experts when you need help. So someone called out before, GPs, not MPs, and I think it's a fantastic line. Well done to whoever came up with that. So it's a very important time, and I would urge you to contact Senator Jackie Lambie, and even if you've got Tasmanian friends, probably more powerfully, contact your Tassie contacts and your colleagues and your relatives, your family, anyone that is a Tasmanian, and please ask them to call Jackie, and just to remember that we're actually all human beings. We're all the same on the inside. We all want a safe life. We all want our family to have the best chance at a happy and healthy life. And that no government should deny that to someone. That 70 years ago we signed up to say that of course we would respect their human rights. Look at how far this government has fallen. It is just heartbreaking, and my only consolation is that they are so out of step with Australian values that they can't last. But I thought that last time, so I'm a natural optimist. So we live in hope, and I just want to finish by saying I think you are all absolute heroes. There's some people here, including Freddie in particular, and Paul, and the other members of RAC, who have been coming out to rallies for as long as I've been in politics, and that's been longer than I care to admit. And I'm sure they were doing this for many years prior to that. So Freddie, you are our conscience, and Mark, and Paul. I think I saw Paul earlier, but Mark's here too, of course, as he always is. You're absolute heroes, and you speak to the best of our values. And Uncle Bob, who gave that beautiful welcome that I thought was full of heart and compassion. So I want to let you know that it's powerful today, and particularly on a hot and windy day in the middle of the day as we're facing bushfires on our very doorstep, because our government not only does it not like people in need, but it doesn't think much of climate science either, but that's another story. You've braved the conditions and you've come out, and I want to let you know that it is these sorts of demonstrations of real Australian values that led to the Medevac Bill being passed in the first place. So you are having an impact. Dr. Barri, you spoke so incredibly well. Sandra from the union, who have been absolute stalwarts at supporting the cause of people in need who are just like us. Thank you so much for your strong values and for your courage and your compassion in speaking out. Thank you everyone for being here today, and we will hold our breath for the rest of the year, and we will try like absolute hell to keep this repeal bill off the agenda. So we've all got a part to play in that. Please make sure your phones run hot, your emails run hot, and that you get on the blower to your Tasmanian colleagues and get them to make sure that Jackie stands firm, because we don't really know what's going to happen. But thank you for being good people in the world. Thank you for being here today, and please don't ever give up hope that we can make positive change. Thanks everybody.
Because we are respectful of the conditions and all human beings, we will not be having a march in this hot weather. We will instead, and Mark will lead this, gather for a photograph in front of our magnificent banner, Save Medevac, Refugee Lives Matter. We will not rest until freedom comes for people seeking asylum on our shores. We will welcome the stranger. And all the signs that you've brought, thank you very much. As you move, please check the tables. A pamphlet to take away, a post-it note to fill out, a memory that on the Wednesday the 22nd of November, Labour for Refugees will be screening that film we spoke about, Against Our Oath, the story of the professionals, a deep multi-layered documentary which you need to watch 2 or 3 times. So start, if you haven't seen it, with the Labour for Refugees screening. So Lennon Wall I've mentioned, and this is the wonderful Mark Gillespie.
Yes, everybody, there's going to be another protest here at 3:30 this afternoon about the situation that's happening in Chile, and everybody here is invited to join that protest. There's going to be speeches, music, culture, and then there's going to be a march, and people are fighting for human rights in Chile. So you're all invited to that. But we're not going to, RAC is not going to march here today, but instead we're all going to come together and we'll round off the protest with one big photo shoot that we'll put out on social media. So if I can get everybody between the 2 balls there, if you stand along there, try to crowd in, hold up banners, maybe pick up these. We'll have these guys in the front, and the people who want to come take photos should come up this way, and we'll take photos back that way.